name is Jeff Tumlin, as Ken told you, and I was born in Los Angeles. I do live in San Francisco now, and I've lived there for all of my adult life. But Los Angeles really shaped a lot of things about the way I see the world. Like most boys in any era, but particularly boys growing up in the 70s, I was really fixated, by all modes of transportation, drew lots of pictures of modes of transportation, but I was particularly fixated by the automobile, in large part because I watched lots and lots of TV growing up in LA in the 1970s. And the car commercials taught me some very clear lessons. That buying my own personal automobile just as quickly as I possibly could would be the thing that would get me power and freedom and autonomy, and of course, I would later figure out sex, right? We were all promised this, and it's so much a part of our relationship with our cars, the way we view cities, and our disappointment sometimes with the way things worked out. So a lot of this image that we have in the United States of the car being central to our culture comes from one source, and that is what is called the Futurama exhibit of the 1933, 39, and 64 World's Fairs. This exhibit remains the most visited industrial exhibit in the history of the world. The 1933 World's Fair, in the heart of the Great Depression, middle of the Great Depression, almost half of the entire population of the United States made it to the World's Fair. And once there, everyone saw this exhibit called Futurama, which showed this spectacular vision of the future. And you can imagine living in the Great Depression, but even living in an early 20th century or late 19th century city. It's crowded. We've barely just gotten rid of the horse as a mode of transportation. You can imagine what that smelled like in the summertime. The cities are jam-packed, sewage systems are barely functioning, we're dumping waste into canals, and the automobile promised us complete transportation, literally, completely transporting us into a world of unlimited freedom and opportunity. Not only in the Great Depression, but also in the 1964, coming out of World War II with all of our newfound wealth, the General Motors sponsored Futurama exhibit. It's important to know who paid for this exhibit all 3 times. Promised us a future of unlimited personal mobility, both spatially and economically, provided we could each have a General Motors car in our own garage. This also influenced popular culture throughout the country. So one of the still the most popular cartoons in the history of cartooning. What year were the Jetsons from? 1962. And yet, even today, we ask children today, in fact, there's some children in the room, have you seen this cartoon? Do you know what we're talking about? You haven't seen this cartoon. Well, how many of the rest of you saw this cartoon? Right, all right. For all of us, if we were to draw a picture of the city of the future, most likely we are going to draw from imagery from the Jetsons from 1962. Our vision of the city of the future is trapped in this weird, kitschy yesterday land. And even Disneyland, where I worked when I was 16, doesn't know what to do with its Tomorrowland exhibit. It is completely flummoxed. There is no greater and more diabolical cultural geniuses than the people who designed Disneyland. And their vision of the city of the future is basically frozen in 1955 when that portion of the park was built. There's been almost no change, and they don't know what to do, in part because it remains so popular, including the General Motors sponsored Autopia exhibit, which was built before the interstate highway system was built, in order to allow all Americans to imagine the joy of, look at these happy people driving, in little cars, across America. And yet, we wonder why we are so disappointed when everything that we've been promised for 50 years and continue to be promised in television commercials, why there is somehow this gap between what we were promised and what we're experiencing in our daily commutes. One of the things that my mother would have really preferred I had become rather than a transportation planner is a doctor. In part because doctors make more money, but also because they have really, really good data, and mom likes data. So the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta has been collecting data on American obesity rates since, well, this slide starts in 1985. And, it shows, there's a, varying pattern of obesity in the United States, and, it's increasing a little bit here and there. We need to change the scale in 1991, because in the Mississippi Basin, 15 to 19% of adults are clinically obese in 1993. 98, 99, changed the scale again, because over a quarter of adults in Mississippi come 2001 are clinically obese. 4, 5, we change the scale again, 6, 7, 8, and so on, where in many states, over a third of adults are clinically obese. And what do you know, the more recent graphs that we see about rates of walking and daily physical activity match perfectly with these maps of obesity, as do the maps of rates of cardiovascular disease and maps of rates of diabetes across the United States. The other thing that we have found increasingly through medical science, and particularly in neuroscience, is how the chemistry of the brain affects our daily behavior, the way we see the world that we're in, and particularly the way we relate to each other. And my favorite neuropeptide, in all of the interesting background research that I did on neuroscience when writing my book, is this one. This is called oxytocin. Oxytocin is literally the biological basis of trust. It is the neuropeptide that says, if I sacrifice a little something, I'll get something back from you. Literally, if I scratch your back, my back will get scratched in turn at some point in the future. It's the neuropeptide that allows us to form lasting trust bonds, both within our families and within our tribes or our neighborhoods. And oxytocin is released under very specific circumstances. It's also, of course, sold online. You can get it. We don't want to talk about that. It's released under very specific circumstances. It is released particularly having lingering eye contact with the person you love. Beautiful, and we've experienced this, right? You come home to your honey, you look that person in the eye, and suddenly things change. They feel better. It's all going to be okay. It's released, of course, in orgasm very prominently, as well as breastfeeding. But it is also released in something as simple as outdoor exercise. The scientists don't understand why it is not released while running on a treadmill in the gym. It is released in outdoor exercise, and just kind of any sort of exercise. Walking, biking, snowshoeing, skiing, any of those sorts of activities. In fact, you've also all experienced this phenomenon in your brain as well. No matter how bad things were at home, if you went out and went for a walk, or went for a run, or went for a hike in the hills, suddenly you got perspective again. Oxytocin is the brain's way of saying, you know what, it's all going to be okay. And so it is important as we design our cities, and particularly as we establish transportation systems for our cities, to be thinking about what is it that's really important? What are we designing for and planning for? And how do we accommodate not just the efficiency of the overall transportation system, but our physical and social and psychological needs as human social primates, right? What is at the foundation of what we need as humans, and how do we make sure that our plans and programs and regulations are reflecting those fundamental needs? Because in addition to designing cities well, allowing us to be happier and healthier and more trusting, designing cities badly also has tremendous negative outcomes. Road rage is in fact now a clinical term. It's a clinical condition. And it's a clinical condition that results, again, from a specific set of circumstances. When you are driving in your car and particularly if you're going fast, but because you're surrounded by this carapace of metal and glass, the social signals that we are accustomed to receiving as we're walking around the street or sitting with our friends or going to the shopping mall, all of that is shut down. Our brains, our eyes, every aspect of our bodies, the way we have 147 muscles in the face, all of those are designed to be sending an immense number of important social signals to and from each other at all times. So you can walk down the most crowded street in Manhattan and never run into anyone, even though you don't have blinkers on your belt, because you're constantly sending nonverbal communication to the people around you about what your intentions are. If you did happen to run into somebody on a downtown Manhattan street, all you need to do is sort of pause, lift your shoulders, tilt your head a little bit, offer an acknowledgement and an apology. Don't need to say a word, and that instance is gone. It's forgiven, it's forgotten about, doesn't exist anymore. In a car, however, you may be driving along the freeway at 50 miles an hour and suddenly realize that your exit is coming up, scoot over really quickly, not realizing that you've just cut somebody off. And that person behind you is screaming now at the top of his lungs, gets no response from you, which then triggers the fight or flight response in the amygdala of the brain, the most primitive part of the brain. So this person has just had both his social status and his personal safety threatened. So that reptilian part of the brain triggers because that same part that knows what to do when we're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. That part of the brain gets triggered, and what happens then? A whole bunch of things. Firstly, the muscles tense, blood goes to the extremity, you're ready to fight. Very importantly, the prefrontal cortex of the brain shuts down. This is the part of the brain that thinks through the consequences of actions. And when you're being chased by the saber-toothed tiger, you need to act instinctively and not think through, well, let's see, if I jump this way and grab that stick, would I have time to poke the tiger in the eye? No, by that point in time, you've been eaten. So it also raises all the emotions, shuts down pain control, makes one sort of more angry, more reactive, much more conservative when one's thinking, and all sort of social conventions get thrown out the window. So now that's all well and good. The brain is designed to do this. It runs through its response, and of course, we all have done things while driving behind the wheel that we would absolutely never ever do in social space, right? We say things out loud where we behave aggressively and obnoxiously. That the fact that we are protected from that social signals both allows us to behave inappropriately, but it's also the thing that is triggering that inappropriateness. So if this pattern gets repeated many times a day, every day, because you're stuck driving to work every day in horrible traffic congestion, what happens is permanent changes in our brains. We become permanently more angry and more mistrustful, and permanently less capable of thinking through the consequences of our actions. It literally causes brain damage. And so one of the things that I will urge you to consider as you work together as a city to come up with a streets plan is, what are the values that you are trying to prioritize, and how do you make for a happier or healthier city? And how do we stop designing the city largely around this thing rather than that thing or that? So, right now, in most cities that I work in all over the United States, almost all of them have very lofty goals around personal health and happiness and CO2 reduction and walkability and transit orientation. And yet when I go and I look at the codes and regulations and guidelines that engineers, architects, and planners are forced to build to, this is sort of the only thing that is possible to be built. And this is, in fact, a complete street, according to the guidelines of the city that this was in, because, in fact, this is a mixed-use environment. So you've got you got a hotel over there and some employment. This doesn't really work on that screen. There's some jobs, there's some apartments over there. There's sidewalks on both sides of the street. And indeed, you know, it's a multimodal environment because there is a pedestrian. But obviously, this is not an environment that any rational person would ever want to walk in. And if you worked on one side of the street and you needed to get lunch on the other side of the street, you would probably get in your car and drive across the street. And so one of the things that I urge all of my clients to look at is whether there is a contradiction between the policy goals in your community and its rules and regulations. So let's talk about a few of those contradictions and what to do. In the transportation world, we are obsessed with this concept of level of service. Level of service is a letter grade system that tries to estimate the seconds of delay that a car might experience at an intersection in typically the peak 15-minute period. And each letter difference is about 15 seconds of delay, and it's measured according to an A to F scale. And so when you've got a big empty roadway, that's level service A, that's really good. And if your roadway is really, really crowded, jammed full of cars and buses and pedestrians and things, that's level service F, that's really bad. Except if you had a different perspective. Say, for example, you were an economist. If you were an economist, you would say that during the peak 15-minute period, of course the infrastructure needs to be full, right? You've designed it exactly to the right size. And if the rest of the day there's plenty of capacity, that means you have maximum utilization of your resource. You've built the right width of street, the right amount of infrastructure, and you're getting the best use out of that. And that if you were to do the empty street with the empty parking lots and the empty sidewalks, that is, one, spending too much money in infrastructure, and two, you're not getting any benefit. There's no people out there shopping or walking or spending money. So the first thing to know is that the current way of measuring success in transportation may have some unintended negative consequences and may not capture all of the things that the transportation system needs to deliver a community. Even though right now, for most cities, this is the only metric that they use. And we use level of service in part because people don't like congestion. So as transportation planners and as city staff here, people get stuck in congestion, they're late, it's annoying, it's horrible, nobody likes sitting in traffic congestion, and so they complain, and as a result, the city will then decide to widen the roadway in order to make the complaints go away. So they widen the roadway, people are happier, and like, oh, great, now that there's no congestion, I can go across town to that new restaurant that's just opened, or I can get a bigger house farther away and still be able to get to work in time. So when there is no congestion, people make decisions about where they're going to live and what they're going to do and where they're going to work based upon this assumption that there's no congestion. And then once people make that decision, of course, more people drive and you have congestion again. And this cycle repeats itself. Widening roads does not eliminate congestion. It never has. How many of you have been promised, as you've been voting for sales tax measures to expand the transportation system in the region, that we're finally going to get rid of congestion, that finally just this one more lane, we're going to relieve congestion and we'll be done? No, it doesn't happen. What happens with infrastructure investment is that it creates economic opportunity. It also can create significant improvements or degradation in quality of life. So transportation capital investments are largely about economic development and a lot less about congestion. And if we want to manage congestion, really the only thing that we can do is manage land use or price the transportation system like we do any other good in society, but that is a far more complicated lecture. Another problem with level of service analysis is the tools that we use for estimating level of service. Historically, looking back since the 1960s, as automobile ownership rose in the United States, we saw a significant increase in rates of driving. And so most of our tools have this built-in assumption of background growth of traffic, that no matter what we do, people will keep driving more. We have a problem, though, in that you young people in this room are not behaving correctly according to the models, and you need to change that. One of the things that we found with people under the age of 28 or 30 is that while my generation believed the television commercials when they told us that buying a car would bring us freedom and autonomy and social status and sex, there's another thing that is competing for the attention of the young people that is much more effective at delivering those things. And in fact, the car is the only thing that takes them away from the thing that's going to get them what they want. And so as a result, there is a dramatic reduction in the number of young people getting driver's licenses. Over 30% reduction of 16-year-olds getting driver's licenses in the United States. Survey after survey, what do young people want? They want, technology. They do not want cars. And so as a result, we've seen in about June of 2005, what may well be peak driving for the United States, and a significant drop since then that has not corrected itself despite the economic recovery. This has the automobile industry, the fuel industry, and the related industries, including the United States Home Builders Association, in a complete panic. But it is very interesting, and it means that we need to make sure that these trends are taken into account in the way we're estimating future traffic congestion. There are other things that we might care about as well, like, for example, property value or quality of life. We know exactly how much street trees add value to adjacent property, and yet that is not something that is ever captured in any value equation about how we should be designing streets. New York City provides a great set of examples in their publication called Measuring the Street. Measuring the Street is available free online at the New York City DOT. But they've done a fantastic job of actually calculating how when they've done interventions with streets, reducing the amount of parking on the street or reducing travel lanes in order to create cycle tracks or public plazas, what the effect is on the people who are using that street, and what the effect is on injuries, on commercial vacancies, on commercial sales, and on whether people like it. And so more and more and more data, not just about intersection level of service, but are people happy? Is the quality of life improved? Have retail sales improved? Have injuries been reduced? Are there more people walking? Are there more people cycling? Are there more people taking transit? So, lesson number one, be very clear about what you want the transportation system to deliver in your community, and make sure that the metrics of success of the transportation system reflect your local values. Point number two, the best transportation plan is always a good land use plan. So put the needs of daily life within walking distance and make sure that that walk is delightful. This last point is particularly important, that the quality of the pedestrian experience should never, ever be degraded, because every single mode of transportation depends upon the walk working, particularly in a place like downtown San Mateo. Downtown San Mateo physically can't accommodate every trip here being by car. And even the trips that are by car can't physically happen right at the front door of every business. You come here, you've got to walk a block or two to get to your final destination. That needs to be a delightful experience. And if you're sacrificing the pedestrian experience in order to accommodate any other mode of transportation, you're undermining the whole foundation of your transportation system. This happens to be Santa Monica, but it might as well be San Mateo. One of the things that is fantastic about this community is not only here in downtown, but in some of your other neighborhood commercial centers, you've got increasingly the needs of daily life all available here, that you don't have to get in the car in order to take care of your basic business. It's also important to keep in mind that while we focus a lot on the commute trip is less than 20% of total household trips. Most of our trips are errand running and social and taking our kids around, so make sure that the needs of daily life are within walking distance, or at least a very short distance. Point number three, make cycling safe and pleasant for people of all ages. And that means this is your design cyclist, not the 30-year-old in Lycra. And one of the reasons why that should be your design cyclist is because nothing attracts cycling more than more cyclists. And even more interestingly, nothing makes cycling safer than more cyclists. As cyclists get more and more out there on the street, the overall visibility of cycling as a legitimate mode of transportation becomes greater, and motorists learn to expect cyclists out there on the street. This is the increase in cycling in Portland, Oregon. The orange line is the decrease in the cycling crash rate over time. In 2013, there were 0 fatalities on bikes once again in the entire city of Portland, Oregon. So if you get more cyclists out there on the street, and if you manage your streets for moderate motor vehicle speeds, you can get this sort of results as well here in San Mateo. And you do that not by focusing on the people at the far left end of the demographic scope, which are the ones that are mostly catered to now, people like me who are comfortable cycling in a narrow bike lane adjacent to high-speed and high-volume motor vehicle traffic, but the huge zone, the over 60 to 70% of Americans in that green area that would love to be able to bicycle, but feel like they can't now because it's simply too scary. Those are the people that we need to pander to in order to make cycling better for all of us. And again, New York, also Seattle have fantastic data about how not only investing in new bike infrastructure brings out a lot more cyclists, but also specifically how it improves safety, but also how it improves retail sales. And this has been a surprise both in New York and in Seattle, just how much easier it is to shop locally if you're on a bike and it's instantaneous to park your bike and run into local stores. It means making it that much easier to support the local economy. Point number 4 is to make transit fast, frequent, reliable, and dignified. And the dignified part, I think, is particularly important. This happens to be a tram line in Montpellier in France, but their buses also look exactly the same. And I want to point out some critical details in how transit is designed in France. One of the things you'll notice is that the floor of the bus is level with the level of the sidewalk. So people with strollers, people in wheelchairs, old people, young people, very easy to step on and off the bus. The doors are very wide, and there are many of the doors, but very importantly, notice the windows. There are floor-to-ceiling windows in the entire length of both the buses and the trams. Totally clear glass, no advertising panel wraps. And this is because riding transit in France is an urban, sociable activity. When you're on a bus or a tram in France, notice you can see all the way through the vehicle. You can actually see storefronts, what's in the storefront on the other side of the vehicle. But you can also see that there happens to be, maybe an attractive person that you might want to smile with that's on that vehicle. Maybe somebody that you might actually meet at the next stop. This designing for the possibility of flirtation is designing for the possibility of great cities. If you notice how retailers design their stores, like Whole Foods or Draper's, they spend an absolute fortune on lighting. And they're not just lighting the beautiful produce, they're lighting you. People go to stores where they feel attractive and where they see other attractive people in kind. We love flirtation as social primates. And all aspects of your city, including your public transit, needs to be designed in order to accommodate that. And indeed, lots and lots of data about what happens when you make transit dignified, fast, frequent, and reliable. You get big increases in ridership, big shift from private automobile travel, and it becomes especially true if you make people's time worthwhile and productive while they're on the bus by, for example, providing Wi-Fi. Point number 5, and this is one of the things that we're helping to work on a little bit here for you all in San Mateo, is to adopt the right street design manual. In most cities in the United States, the design manual that they're using derives from a rural highway set of data. What makes streets safe in a rural highway condition is accommodating driver error. So by providing wide travel lanes, wide shoulders, so if somebody sort of nods off or has had a couple to drink or isn't really paying any attention or is fiddling with the knobs and you sort of drift out of your lane, that there's plenty of space for recovery. What works very well in the rural and highway context, however, is the opposite in an urban context. That what we find in an urban context is that if the dimensions are all really big and there's lots of accommodation for error, people pay less attention. And what we actually want to do is to, in fact, create the perception of danger in urban driving environments in order to raise the actuality of safety. Driving is, in fact, really, really dangerous. It should feel dangerous. Danger signals us all, it signals our brain to pay attention. So we don't want to make driving feel so dangerous that it, people really just stop driving or it's just, terrifying to go out there. But we need to send signals to drivers to pay attention in an urban environment because there's stuff coming at them from all different directions. Fortunately, there's a set of new guidelines that are available nationally, primarily from the National Association of City Transportation Officials, that have, based upon real-world data in cities, recommended the safest urban infrastructure for streets and also for bikes. And these are continually being updated, and the city can simply adopt them as their guidelines. Point number 7, and one of my favorites, is to be smart about parking. And San Mateo is already doing a fair amount about this, but one of the things that is critically important as we get smart about parking is to recognize why we charge for parking. We charge for parking not because cities are evil, money-grubbing bastards, although some of them are. Not this one, it seems great. We charge for parking in order to make sure that customers can always find a space. That cities will always make more money off of a successful commercial district than they will off of parking meters. And that parking meters are basically a support for getting the parking availability that customers actually want. And so one of the things that we demand first when we start charging for parking is to make sure that we make it really easy to pay. And so, I don't know how many of you are carrying sacks of quarters around in your pockets, but doing like what you've done here in the downtown to allow the parking meters to accept forms of payment that normal humans actually have in their wallets, like credit cards and debit cards, critically important because the transactional cost of hunting around for quarters is far greater than the $3 you might spend at the meter. The next thing to realize is that it costs here in San Mateo probably between $30,000 and $70,000 per parking space to build a parking space. That's a lot of money. $30,000 to $70,000 per parking space means that it is always cheaper to use technology to help motorists find some tucked away empty parking space somewhere that already exists, rather than build a new parking space. There's fantastic technology that's out there that helps people find the space that they need. Always think about what are the technological solutions to take advantage of existing empty spaces, including and especially existing empty private spaces. The next step, and this of course is a map from Redwood City, is to establish the right price for parking. The right price for parking is always the lowest price that achieves your availability goal. The right price for parking is always the lowest price that achieves your availability goal, because we're charging for parking so customers can find a space. If you charge too much, you're going to drive customers away, we'll have too many empty parking spaces. If you charge not enough, all your spaces will be full, motorists will drive around in circles, they'll be driven away because they can't find a space. The right price is always the lowest price that achieves your availability target, and that means that that price is going to vary. In the core of your city, it's going to be a lot more expensive than at the edge. It's going to be a lot more expensive on 3rd Avenue than it's going to be in the garages. It's going to be more expensive also at different times of day. Because it's also important to recognize that you need to charge over the right time period. This is a meter from Pasadena, California, where the merchants actually run the parking program. And the merchants realized that Pasadena is a evening restaurant and entertainment district. Their peak parking demand is not Monday through Friday, 9 to 6. Their peak parking demand is Friday and Saturday nights. And so they extended their meter hours until midnight on Friday and Saturday nights. And you'll notice that their parking demand is the same on Sunday as it is on Saturday, and that there is not, in fact, anything in Leviticus that says that parking must be free on Sundays. So they set the right time, and they take all of the net revenue that comes out of those meters and invest it in downtown improvements. Other important considerations include sharing parking, allowing different businesses to use the same space, unbundling the price of parking from the price of housing, so households with fewer cars can afford more house, and households with many cars can actually have place to put them. But what's really important is to think about how we look at parking as a system, and this is particularly true in places like San Mateo. So imagine that's El Camino. And let's say you've got different land uses along El Camino, and each land use has its own parking lot that's associated with it. And you're, in your daily life, you've got to drive your daughter to school, and that requires a parking space. And then you go to work, and that requires parking, and then you've got to go take your daughter across the street to soccer practice because she can't walk across El Camino because it's too scary. And you go, you park, and you do some grocery shopping, you pick your daughter up, and you go home. And that's, it's compacted, but theoretical, but it's many of our daily lives, and it's a lot of traffic, and it's a lot of turning movements off of El Camino, each of which is causing disproportionate impact in terms of congestion. So imagine, slightly differently, imagine you're in now downtown San Mateo, and your land uses are arrayed on a grid of streets, as they are here, and parking is in the back, and it's shared, and it's partly decked. And now you can drive and you can park in the garage there on the alley, and your daughter can walk herself to school while you go to work. She can get herself to soccer practice. You can pick up your groceries on your way back to your car. You can eat in the car, and you go home. And this is the exact same trip as the previous trip. But because of the difference in the way that we've handled parking, the result is half of the parking area, half of the land area, or twice as much economic development per acre of land as in the previous option. A quarter of the arterial trips, 1/6 of the arterial turning movements, and less than a quarter of the vehicle miles traveled. Still a car trip, but it was a park once and do several things trip. And this is how great walkable downtowns like yours work. They are phenomenal magnets for economic activity with very, very few auto trips compared to other ways of arranging land uses. Fantastic. Point 7, and this is the final one that I'm going to leave you with before we take some questions and answers, is that, so coming back around to what is important. It is firstly very important for you all to decide for yourselves what kind of a city do you want to live in. What is your vision for the city of the future? And based upon what values? What is important to you, to your family, to your kids? What kind of a city do you want your children and your grandchildren to inherit? And how does the transportation system support that in all of its myriad ways? I can't tell you that. You need to tell us that, tell the city that, and to make sure that the rules and the regulations and the guidelines of the city support those values. One value, though, that I think I can confidently tell you is an important one that we make sure not be forgotten about. And again, it goes back to who we are as social primates and the way that our brains are hardwired. Our brains are hardwired to crave beauty. And while there are many types of sensory experiences that lose their vigor over time, we never tire of beauty. And in fact, I would argue that beauty is at the heart of sustainability. Nothing is sustainable if it's not maintained. And in fact, the most sustainable thing that you can do is to keep what you already have running well, and to adapt it and maintain it, and to love it over time. Maintaining your old car or fixing up your old building is always greener or more sustainable than buying a new car or building even a platinum-rated LEED new building. Decide what it is that you love here, what it is beautiful, and make sure that as you build your new city, that you make sure that it is indeed a beautiful place that you're going to love and maintain and that your children will cherish. Thank you.